Well, I was born and raised in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, and graduated from high school there, and then graduated from UWSP in 1969, and that was a summer when most of the students, most of the graduates were drafted because a lot of us had 4 or 5 years of college, and we lost our student deferments after that amount of time, and most of us were all drafted. There were a few people that enlisted so that they could get their branch of service, but most everybody else was drafted. I went to basic training at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the 101st Airborne Division. At that time, though, they were in Vietnam, and after that, I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana, where I was trained in mortars, and after that, at that point we got our orders for Vietnam. I didn't think that I would be in the infantry, and I didn't think that I would learn how to use mortars because of being a college graduate and such. But the Army has its own mind, and most everybody that was drafted that summer ended up in the infantry. When we got to Vietnam, we processed in country. Actually, we went up, before we went to Vietnam, we went to Oakland Army Terminal, and then we flew from Travis Air Force Base up to Alaska, to Japan, and then down to Ben Wire Base outside of Saigon. When we were there, we processed in country, and then we were assigned to our permanent duty station, and lo and behold, I was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division up in I Corps, which is was the first military region south of the DMZ. So it basically was from the DMZ south to close to the Central Highlands, south of Da Nang, and from the South China Sea over to the Laotian border. I was not in Vietnam for that long. The tour, the Standard Army tour, was 12 months. I got to Vietnam in early January, and I lost my arm on April 18th, 1970, so I was really only there for 3.5 months, though my records show that I was there till the 1st of May, and that was basically because I was on a hospital ship, so I was still in territorial waters. We were up in the mountains up near the A Shell Valley, and we were building a new Firebase, which actually became a staging area for what that summer of 1970 was the Battle of Firebase Ripcord. There had been some penetrations across the DMZ into the lowlands near Quan Tri and south to Hue and such, and we were to come out of the mountains and set up a perimeter, night defensive perimeter around a fire base, a secure fire base called Bass Stone, but the weather was prohibited us from getting out of the mountains early in the day, and we weren't able to get out until late in the afternoon, and we didn't have any food or ammunition left, so we had to get resupplied. And by the time we got resupplied, we really had to set up our night defensive position right where we had landed. About 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, we were attacked from the opposite ridge line with rocket-propelled grenades, and that's when I lost my arm. And everybody else that was in my squad died at that time. Our medic had to come in from the other platoon, and they didn't know where our trip flares or booby traps were, so it was kind of an iffy thing. They didn't want to come in to aid us, but they did. The medevacs didn't want to come in because we were taking enemy fire. So one of the other regular gunships came in and took me out. And there was actually one other person with me that had survived the initial attack, but he, from my understanding, that he later died. I went to 85th Evac Hospital, and it was at that time when I was being medevac that I will swear to this day that I had actually passed over and had died, and then came back to life. Stabilized at the 85th Evac, and then the following day they medevaced me out to the hospital ship Sanctuary, where I had spent about a week. And at that time, I had shrapnel in this eye, and I've got a lot of shrapnel in my face, and I've got a broken neck, and I've got a fusion there, and I've got muscle and nerve loss and damage in both legs. They didn't know if I'd lose the left eye or not, and I had both eardrums were perforated. My right one healed by itself. The left one they needed to do surgery on and redo the eardrum, and they did that with a skin graft. But anyway, I was on the hospital ship Sanctuary for basic stabilization before any major surgeries. Then we were flown to the Army hospital in Japan. It was called Camp Zama. And I was there for about a week, too, for a couple more surgeries, minor surgeries, and further stabilization. When we were stabilized enough to travel, we went on another medevac, and we flew from Japan to Fitzsimmons. Well, we flew to Buckley Field, which was an Air National Guard base just outside of Denver. And then we went to Fitzsimmons General Army Hospital in Denver. While I had been in Japan, they had asked me where I'd wanted to go when I got back to the States. And I had said, well, I want to go to Great Lakes Naval Hospital up north of Chicago. And they said, nah, you don't want to go there. And I said, yeah, I do. No, you don't want to go there. And it went back and forth on that. And the reason they said I didn't want to go there was because it was a Navy base, and me being in the Army, that means you had to go through liaison officers for treatment and approval and such. Even though it was closer to home here in Wisconsin, they said it'd be too much of a bureaucratic hassle to that, and it's better to go to Fitzsimmons because that was an orthopedic hospital anyway. It was the 5th Army Hospital, which was basically the upper Midwest and the Great Plains, northern Great Plains states. So I went to Fitzsimmons, and I was there from early May of 1970 until end of July of 1971, and went through all sorts of surgeries, and we had to do occupational therapy and physical therapy and all sorts of things like that. And I had further surgeries on my neck and surgeries on my eyes and surgeries on my ears and bone fusions and all sorts of fun little things. After surgeries and after you, for stabilization times, once you became a little more ambulatory, you were allowed to go home on convalescent leave. And I often came back to Wisconsin and came up here, and then would go back and have more surgeries and stabilize and then come back again. So that whole time, even though I was a hospital patient, I did not spend all the time physically in Denver in the hospital. Most at that time, in 1970, there were about 6,000 patients at Fitzsimmons, and most of them, the vast majority of them, were orthopedic patients. And the vast majority of the patients came from the upper Midwest. So there were a lot of people from Wisconsin and Michigan and Illinois and Minnesota. So in some ways, it was like being back in the Midwest and being back at home. So that helped, and people were very, very supportive and very helpful. The medical care at Fitzsimmons and at Camp Zama was absolutely, great, I thought. Once you became ambulatory enough and physically stable, they put you back on light work duty and such. And the commander of the occupational physical therapy department said, "You don't want to do that. That's just busy work anyway. How would you like to go down to the University of Colorado Medical Center and lecture on medical students?" And I said, "I don't know anything about medicine." And he said, "Well, about phantom pain and things like that, things that relate to your injuries." And I said, "Well, I'll try it once." Okay, so I did that. Prior to that, the reason he offered me that job is before that I was transporting wheelchair patients back and forth to occupational and physical therapy. And other than doing that for about 2 hours a day, the rest of the time was mine, and I usually spent it in the base library. And the commandant of the medical holding company said, what's he doing? He was, well, he's transporting patients for me. He's sitting in the library all day, He's going to have to go back on some limited duty. And that's when he made the offer of going down to the University of Colorado Medical School. And went down there and did that once, and it was fine. It was okay. And the commander of the occupational physical therapy department says, wanted me to keep doing that, and I said, nah, I don't think so. And he says, well, let's put it this way. If you don't do that, they're going to put you back on regular duty. And this way, you can go down there 3 days a week, after 3 afternoons a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and lecture for the med students and such. And I says, what do I do the rest of the time? And he says, you're doing lesson plans. And he says, you can come back here and you're doing lesson plans, or you can go any place you want. I don't care what you do. And that. So that became a very, I don't know why I was treated so well that way. I really don't. But I got to do that and had a great time. It was a great experience. And then I came back, when I was medically retired from the Army, I came back to Wisconsin, and I came back to school here and got a master's degree in education and history. And I was also a graduate assistant in the history department and had an office over in one of those buildings, Cops Building, I guess it was. Yeah, fourth floor of the Cops Building, I think it was. And that was great. I had more money and then than I ever had in my life, or even have now, because I had my disability compensation. I went to school on vocational rehab, so I didn't have to pay any tuition. I attended bar, and I had the graduate assistantship. And any class I'd have, I'd get a reading list and go to the university bookstore and say, here, order these books for me. The government's paying for them. And so I established my own library that way, because that was part of the voc rehab thing. After getting my master's degree, got that in May of '74. In June of '74, I got married, and we moved to Colorado, where I was going to University of Colorado in Boulder, working on a doctorate in U.S. history. Did that for a year, and I couldn't play the mental and physical games of academia after. You could tell it was just busy work, some of it to some degree, and it just was not the thing that was stimulating me, and I probably wouldn't have been able to get a job afterwards anyway, because with all the people that were coming back, the military was reduction force, so there were so many people in college, and there just weren't any jobs available. So I came back. Hope I didn't. Okay. So I came back to Wisconsin. I opened a bookstore. Had a bookstore down here in downtown Stevens Point, and my wife is a registered nurse, so she got a job over at St. Michael's, and I had the bookstore for about 3 years. And again, that was perfect timing. It's not that it wasn't a good business, because it was. I enjoyed it, but I didn't make enough money to hire anybody. So I had to work the extra hours, and that was the time it was the oil embargoes and the costs were going up. So it was like treading water. So I got out of that, and I became a house spouse. Raised 2 daughters. The eldest one is in the Foreign Service. Graduated from Michigan State. Got a law degree from the University of Akron. Right now she's in Monterrey, Mexico, and will be coming back to D.C. for training shortly. The youngest daughter is a medical transcriptionist. She's been doing that for 11 years. She was born with spina bifida, one of the effects of Agent Orange exposure. When she was born here at St. Mike's, and we immediately were transferred up to St. Joe's in Marshfield. And they said to us, just go home and forget you ever had her, because she probably isn't going to live any more than 3 weeks to 3 months. And we decided, well, if she's going to die, she's going to die in our house, in her bed, in her home. And got home, and she just thrived. And like I said, now she'll be 32 years old next month. And so she's been working 11 years as a medical transcriptionist. She still lives at home, but she's in a wheelchair. She can walk short distances with crutches, but she's got hand controls in the car, so she's she drives and is quite independent in that, and that is pretty much my life in a nutshell. So if there's anything that you specifically want to ask me and to address, then I'm willing.
Yeah, I'll go back to prior to you going into Vietnam. What was your knowledge of Vietnam itself, the country and the conflict going on there?
Well, I actually had a pretty good background knowledge of Asian history and of Vietnam and such, because as an undergraduate here, I actually graduated with more credits in history than were offered when I started here in 1964. So I mean, I took first and second semester general Asian history, and first and second semester Korean history, and first and second semester Chinese, and first and second semester Japanese, and all that. So I had a pretty good background of knowledge of the history of Asia and Southeast Asia and such. So when I did go to Vietnam, there were some things that you could see that just really, the American government and our approach to that as a country, just there were some things that we did not know the culture, we did not know the people, and we made no effort to understand them. It was just to stop communism or whatever the reason was. As far as the war during my undergraduate years, I and most students really didn't pay undue attention to it or overly pay a lot of attention to it. I mean, other than that, we hoped like the Dickens that we wouldn't ever have to go, and the rationale is, well, it's been going on for this long, it'll be done by the time we graduate anyway, so don't worry about it. But I'm not going to give up that deferment at this point. It really wasn't until TED of 1968 that most Americans, including the college campuses, really started taking notice of what was going on. Prior to that, it was in the news, and you read about it in the paper and the TV programs and the songs that were anti-war and that, but there really wasn't. On this campus, at least, that much, so you really didn't dwell on it so much until after, like I said, TED of 68, and then you started paying attention to it and started getting a little more involved in trying to understand it and such. So when I came back after I got out of the hospital, the war was still going on in Vietnam, because I came back here in fall 71. And by that time, there were protests on campus. The ROTC department at that time was over in Nelson Hall, and there was an anti-war movement on campus that included some people that were Vietnam vets. But generally speaking, there was mutual respect between the Vets Club and the anti-war movement, that as long as you didn't, cause all sorts of damage, you didn't necessarily agree with them, but you respected their rights to have their opinions. So it was not as confrontational on this campus as it was on other campuses like Madison or Berkeley or Columbia. So.
All right. Yes. Now you touched a little bit on your training before, but just I want to go into a little bit further detail. I know you went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and stuff like that.
Right.
Now, do you want to expand more on what type of training you received and how that went?
Basic training. Basic training was 8 weeks long. The first 2 weeks you were confined to the company area, and then, or maybe it was the first week, company area, and then the next 2 weeks you were allowed to go to the battalion area, and then by that time you could actually go to the EM club and have a beer and such like that. But the training was a lot of physical training and a lot of classroom training. You learn to, well, they gave you a little history of Vietnam, but it was just cursory. But you learned, you did a lot of marching and a lot of running. You went to the march and ran to the firing ranges, and you learned. We started with M14s, and you learned to use M16s, and then you had to qualify on. Let's see, what else did we qualify on? You had to qualify on 45 caliber pistol. And that was pretty much it for weapons qualifications. But then you did a lot of calisthenics, and you did a lot of map reading, and went out on bivouacs and that sort of thing, and got familiarized with other weapon systems. Lived in company areas. The first thing in the morning when you got up to Reveille is you went into formation, and then you did physical therapy before breakfast, and then you had a little time after that. And then it was basically classwork, marching to and from it. You did pugilism, what do you call it? Pugil sticks. You know, put your helmet on and hit each other in the head with those things, and hand-to-hand combat, and the whole spectrum of things. And then after about 4 weeks, you were allowed to take weekend leave if you want. A lot of people usually went to Nashville, or some people went to St. Louis. But when we were able to leave the base, we pretty much just went into Clarksville, Tennessee, or Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and raised a little bit of hell, and came back and started the thing all over again. The last week of basic training was a period when you found you had to take a physical test, pass the physical test and endurance test, and the only PT test I ever passed in basic training was the last one. And then you got your assignment for where you were going next, and it was at that point then that you also got your military occupation specialty, which is what your military job would be. And mine was a 1-1 Charlie, 11 Charlie, which was a mortarman. 1-1 Bravo was basic infantryman, a basic rifleman, and there were several hundred different military specialties, occupational specialties, and that's when you went to AIT, which was Advanced Individual Training, and for that I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana. Again, that was another 8 weeks. There, my specialty was mortars, so we learned and had to qualify on 4.2-inch mortars, 81 millimeter mortars, and then we also had to qualify on 50 caliber machine gun, grenade launchers, and I think that was it. Anyway, all told, there was about a half a dozen different weapons that you had to qualify on between basic and AIT. Again, you went out on bivouacs, and you did tried to pretend you were in Vietnam. So you had the enemy forces and the friendly forces, and you had to search and destroy and evade and those sorts of things. And then after 8 weeks of that, you graduated from AIT, and at that point you got your assignment, and most everybody that was in AIT in my cycle got orders to Vietnam. There are a few people actually after basic training at Fort Campbell. There were a number of people that actually stayed at Fort Campbell for their advanced individual training, and they spent their whole military career there. And then there were some that went to other places, some that went to like Redstone Arsenal or New Mexico for the missile training, or whatever the case may be, language training. Some people went to Monterey. But the basic infantry training, infantry arms, was all at Fort Polk, Louisiana. When we graduated from advanced individual training, we got to leave, and then we got our orders to go to Vietnam, and then spent a couple weeks at home, and that was the Christmas time of 1969, and then flew out to California and did out processing, and then, like I said, flew to Japan flew to Vietnam via Japan, Alaska and Japan.
All right, now based off your training, based off your experiences in Vietnam, what would you say, I guess, the preparation level was for an opponent like the NBA? What the level was, how prepared were you guys?
Our training was it was good training. I mean, it was basically what it was as indoctrination, and to you were indoctrinated to follow orders and to demonize the enemy, so that you didn't think of them so much as people, but as an enemy. Much of the training, they always talked about the Viet Cong, so it was guerrilla tactics and hit and run warfare. When I got to Vietnam, I was assigned to the 101st. The opponents up in I Corps were really not the Viet Cong and guerrilla warfare so much. It was regular force divisions. So it was basically the NVA. So they operated much the same way that we operated. I mean, there were pitched battles and there were Firebase. So you didn't run into a couple of people unless they were snipers. You usually ran into squad or platoon or company-sized enemies. So the battles were much more standard in that respect. But you did booby traps were always a problem, and those were hit and run things. We'd set up night defensive perimeters, or we'd set up ambushes just as they would set up ambushes, and so it was much more. That was much more conventional warfare, but it was still jungle warfare up in I Corps with standing force.
Before you said you had majored in history here at UWSP. You had a pretty good understanding of not only like the Vietnamese culture, but the Asian culture itself, right. Chinese or Japanese. Were there any instances in Vietnam where you use that to your squadron's advantage or to your advantage?
The one instance, when I had just gotten assigned to my company, we were still in the lowlands for a couple days, and there had been some enemy resupply trails, and they were trying to resupply their units, and our mission was to interdict those supply lines. So we set up a night ambush in a cemetery, and I had said to our platoon leader, our squad leader and our platoon leader, that this is not a good thing to do. This is not appropriate. We're going to be attacked tonight. And they said, well, you're a cherry. You're just new in country. You don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, I said, these people are ancestor worshippers. How would you like it if somebody set up, an ambush where your family was buried? And well, we've got to do this here because this is where they travel at night and that. And I said, this is not a good thing, and we did get attacked that night, and we did lose a couple people, and in the middle of the night we had to change our positions. But rarely up in I Corps, once we got out of the lowlands, rarely did you ever come into contact with anybody but the enemy. So you really didn't. I didn't have any opportunity to utilize any of the knowledge that I had about Asian cultures and such, because the A Shau Valley and most of the highlands were pretty much basically a free fire zone, and anybody you saw, it was shoot first and ask questions later. So you never really got into that position of being able to utilize any of the knowledge that I had.
Shifting gears now a little bit to a direction. In Vietnam itself, what type of country was it? What was the landscape like? From your experiences, at least, what was the country of Vietnam?
Like I said, we flew into Ben Hoa Air Base outside of Saigon. You get off the plane, and that's very much an urban area, And you get off the plane, and the first thing you notice is the heat. The heat. It's just unbelievably hot and humid, and there's a strong aroma in the air, and it's of all the fresh vegetation and the cooking fires and just the myriad intermingling of smells. That really is the only urban experience at that time that I had, because then we flew up to, which was Camp Eagle, which was 101st Airborne Base Camp. There was Camp Eagle, and there was LZ Sally, and there was Fubai, and that's where the division was stationed. And again, that was in the lowlands, but it was a fortified American base camp. But again, it was flatlands, and that was the area of the rice paddies and such. But again, there was the unbelievable heat, and the smells of a lot of people cramped in a small place, and the vegetation and such. When we went up into the mountains, or up into the jungles, it became a whole different thing. The vegetation, it's very, very dense vegetation. It's very difficult terrain. In the dry season, it's like rock hard. In the rainy season, it's pure mud. There's all sorts of sounds and animals, and tigers and monkeys and all sorts of different birds. There's so many different sounds that it's almost like an outdoor concert. But the jungles are so dense, triple canopy jungle, that even in the middle of the day sometimes everything is cast in shadows, because it's the jungle is so dense and thick. And they had things called wait-a-minute vines that they would grab into your clothes, and you could walk 30, 40 yards, and all of a sudden you'd fall down and couldn't understand why, and then you're like, oh, I've got one of these vines attached to me. And there were spiders that were probably the size of a saucer, a coffee cup saucer, and they would string their webs across the trails, and birds, and the monkeys were just making constant noise. But we never came across, rarely did we come across any vestiges of villages or such, because those were the Montagnards that lived up there, and most of them had been forced out and had moved. The small villages had been abandoned, and the people moved to basically like refugee camps. So there were larger villages, and that. So anybody you ran into, you just, that was a free fire zone. But Vietnam it's an absolutely gorgeous country. I mean, there are so many different shades of green, and it's a beautiful country. It really is. And as hot as I had said it was, it is. But when you're up in the mountains and it gets nighttime, it gets cold. I mean, it gets cold. It gets down into the 50s sometimes. And when you've had temperatures of 100 to 110 or so during the day, and it drops down to 50 at night, you're cold. Yeah. You're freezing. So even though it's a tropical country, and you'd think it'd be hot all the time, it isn't. The nights up in the mountains particularly get very cold.
Kind of like a desert type of thing.
Yeah.
Hot in the day, cold at night.
Yep, absolutely.
You mentioned a little bit about the wildlife.
Okay.
And to someone like me who's obviously never been to Vietnam, doesn't know a ton about the culture or the wildlife, what are some things that surprised you when it came to the wildlife? You mentioned tigers and stuff like that.
there's a bird over there that it talks all the time, but it's GIs call it the "fuck you" bird, because that's what their sound sounds like. You know, when they do that, that's their call, and it just sounds like that. And monkeys always, clamoring around in the trees and such. So there were times you'd actually just shoot the monkeys if there were a few of them, just to get some quiet. Spiders that had hard calcium shells, they could spin a web across the trail in no time. But the only way you could crush them and kill them is with a rifle butt. You would see tiger tracks. You'd see elephant footprints. The one thing you never wanted to see was the bamboo viper, which is a little snake that's, well, it's a viper. It's not really a snake, it's a viper, but about 3 or 4 inches long. And if you get bit by those, you need to get treatment really quick. When the Vietnam War in Vietnam started, there really was no antidote for being bit by a bamboo viper. But by the time I had gotten there, there was an antigen, so that if you did get bit by one, chances are you had a better chance of survival. And then there were the other the large constrictor type snakes in the trees, and you just really, and you couldn't see them. You couldn't see the darn things, and you just were kind of, it was kind of, well, particularly if you're afraid of snakes and you don't see what they're there, and all of a sudden something's hanging or drops down on you, it's kind of an eerie feeling. Fish in the streams, if you did get to a pool, a mountain pool or something, you could, all you really needed to do was just take a string and a safety pin, and you could catch fish and have fresh fish once in a while, but even sea rations and such. But generally speaking, the rivers up in the mountains, there were very few pools of water, and the rivers ran so fast and so cold, and sometimes they were very deep, and when you had to cross the things or hump within them or through them, you had to be very careful, because they ran so quick, so swiftly, and the rocks were so slippery that you could very easily lose your balance and just be gone, swept downstream. So it was types of things that you really had to be on the top of your game all the time.
Yeah, that's something people don't think about too much, just the wildlife and how that affected everything.
Yeah.
I don't want to switch gears again here. It's
sure.
a totally different topic here. And that's the psychological effects of warfare. Stuff like post-traumatic stress. I know we had talked before about this type of thing. What do you think about post-traumatic stress and how it should be treated and stuff like that?
I do believe that anybody who has been in combat and experienced the stress of combat and such probably to some degree has PTSD. Some people are able to cope with it better than others, and I think some of that has to do with your individual strength as a person. It has to do with your community, be it your friends or family, peers, help you to cope with that situation. You get veterans together, and particularly combat veterans, and it's just you just know, and because you can talk with each other, and you understand. But during the Vietnam period, there was very, very little treatment for PTSD. In fact, it wasn't really until the early 70s that PTSD was clinically diagnosed as in the psychiatry DSM manuals. When I got to Japan, a psychologist came by and he said to me, you lost your arm. Yeah, what are you going to do about it? And there's nothing I can do about it. I'll just go on. And you're normal. And that was it. Nowadays, they're giving you, there's more treatment for it, and there's better treatment for it, except I don't think there are enough people trained to be able to address all the issues that their troops today are suffering from. And the concept of post-traumatic stress is kind of one of these things that some people that have it won't admit to it because it's like a taboo subject. It's like you're crazy or something, or you're nuts, or you're a little unhinged or things. And so they don't want to address that and deal with it. Some people just bury it. And then when they get to my age now, it's 30, 40 years later, when your kids are raised and you're retired, and then you got time on your hands and you start thinking about these things, and then all of these demons start coming to the surface. I probably have PTSD to some degree, but I think I've coped with it quite well, I believe. And again, I think that's because of the friends I've had here on campus, the friends I've had back in my hometown, family, and that they just, as long as they're there and they're non-judgmental, that's a support system in and of itself. I would have to say, though, that in those early days, you smoked too much, you drank too much, you didn't have a real healthy lifestyle, and you come to a point where you realize, well, I got to do something about this, or else you're just going to keep going down that whirlpool, and it's hard. It's very difficult. There's very few people you can talk to. Today, I think the PTSD is more readily accepted as a medical condition that needs to be treated, and it needs to be caught right away, and it needs to be, you need to go through therapy and such. And again, it's still not an easy thing, though, and it affects everyone differently based upon their experiences. There are some people that use it as a crutch, I believe. That, oh, poor me, poor me, poor me, and it's that. And there are other people that it really is debilitating for them, and they try and fight it. So.
Okay, yeah, and based on your experiences with PTSD, would you say that there should be more programs, stuff that would set up veterans, combat veterans, to talk to each other more often?
There are a lot of good programs out there, and I think there are more. They need to be established in such a way that they address the needs of the veterans as they perceive their needs to be. If that means a coffee klatch, if that means sitting around a table talking about your experiences, if that means going out on a hunting trip together or a fishing trip or whatever the case may be together, so you can just have to understand these things, or if it needs to be in a clinical setting within a hospital or a clinic, with or without medication types of things. But first, you've got to have that valid evaluation initially to see where you're at in that and be open to it. But I'm not so sure that there are enough qualified people to address all of the troops that are coming back now that have PTSD. And I think some of that, I feel that some of that is our government's fault, because the regular Army, the volunteer Army, has valid means of training people so that you can see these things and you can figure out the strong and weak psychological, points of each individual soldier. It's when you start getting Reserve and National Guard. Reserve people are probably not as bad off because they have more of the same training that the regular Army has, and they go on active duty every year and such because they're meant to supplement them. But the National Guard troops, as much as they've been called upon, their primary purpose is National Guard. It's not to go overseas and fight wars. So I think they're the ones that, with their families back home and their jobs back home, I think they're more susceptible to succumb to the dangers of PTSD than perhaps the troops in the regular Army. Not saying that they're not all vulnerable. It's just I think the National Guard ones are more vulnerable because their initial job was different. But now it's become the same. There are more things involved too, because it becomes not just the individual soldier, it becomes their family, their wife and their children and their parents and the community. Whereas in my day, very few of the soldiers were married beforehand, and your parents put up with you because they were your parents, and sometimes you just kind of left anyway, and they couldn't understand why, and you just associated with your peers. But now most of these people, they were one person, and they had a family, and they had a wife, or they had a spouse, and they had kids, and they had jobs, and then they go off and they see the horrors of war, and they come back and they are not the same person that left, and the rest of the family can't understand why that is. Where is my husband or my wife, or where is the father that I knew? Well, he's not there anymore. He doesn't exist anymore. And that's I think one of the things that makes it more difficult today for medical personnel that have to deal with the people that have PTSD and other psychological and traumatic problems.
And based on your work with the Voices of War Research Project, I know you're very involved with it. Has that helped you in any way with any of these side effects of war?
It was, the whole experience was very positive. This Visions of War thing. It was very positive. Let me go back once though and say that back in 1996, I had gone back to Vietnam with a number of veterans from the 101st Airborne, and there were officers, and there were helicopter pilots, and there were artillerymen, and there were infantrymen, and so it was a broad spectrum. And we went and retraced the history of the division, and by that time, by 96, I had thought that I had pretty well come to terms with my service in Vietnam and what had happened to me and everything. But there was one instance when we got off the bus at China Beach, and my whole time in country there, we had one stand down, and that was one night where we left the mountains and we went to China Beach, and everybody got off the bus, and I had to change film in my camera, and I got off the beach, or I got off the boat, the bus, and walked around a corner, and there was this building, and it was exactly the way it was back in 1969. It's 27 years later, and it's still there. It looks exactly the same, and it's like all of a sudden I'm back there. That was a little tough, but that trip in and of itself, some of these guys really were having some problems, and us just being able to be with each other as brothers, and put your arm around them and hug them and, you know, both cry and whatever, was very, very cathartic. It was very helpful for everybody. And this Visions of War thing, I think it was, I found it to be an uplifting experience, and I think the artists that the Iraq War vets that I've talked with found that to some degree that they can understand their experience a little bit better now, because other than the fact that the location and the type of the war is different, the results are the same, whether it be Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, World War II. The psychological and physical effects on the soldiers is the same. The only thing that was really kind of weird was the poetry reading over at MSTC when Brian Turner was reading those poems. You know, there wasn't anything that he said or read that I hadn't heard before, but there was that one poem. It's just the way it was worded and the way he stated it just hit me that I just had to get up and walk out, because there were so many things that came flashing back all of a sudden because I had not looked at it from the perspective of the way he stated it. Even though I've heard all these things before and pretty much know how to address them, it was just the way he said that was different. That really caused me to I got to get out and take a deep breath before I whatever. So that part was helpful to me. The last event, well, actually the first event when the gallery opened. There was really some mind-boggling stuff in there, and I've met a few of the artists from Vietnam, but I think Vietnam had more printed literature and printed literature and music than it did visual arts. And I'm thinking you're finding more visual arts. I could be wrong on that. That's just from seeing this, that's my perspective anyway. There's really some haunting stuff that was in that. And I looked at that and it brought back memories to me, but it was such like wow, my experience was bad, but I sure as hell wouldn't want to do what they had to do, meaning now. You know, and that's almost kind of contradictory. But that was a good experience because it allows you to expand your mind and see how other generations. Did I think that way when I was that age? Did I do those same things? And I probably did, but it manifested itself differently. Instead of the visual arts, it was in some other form or fashion. And the only other thing about that Visions of War thing, the very last night, when they had the Operation Homecoming video, and then we had the discussion in the gallery, I thought it was a decent movie. The one thing at the end, though, was about saving Chase, and I have read that book, and I have seen the commercial version of that story with Kevin Bacon and such, and it's very emotional. But there was one guy, an elderly gentleman. At least he looked older to me. He looked older than I do, but from his comments, I don't think he's quite as old as I am. And he said that whole film made him furious about this thing, and then he started ragging on us about, well, why don't you as soldiers try to do something about policy, and it's like we're just grunts, you know. We do what we're told, you know, and that's it. And it's just like, how can you expect the foot soldier to be a policymaker, or how can we even change policy now that we're veterans. The only way we can have any effect on policy is write your representatives and talk to your friends and neighbors and get them to write and just speak out and be involved in veterans and organizations and social organizations that address the need of veterans and the active duty. And that's the only way I see that monetarily that you can actually hopefully have some impact on policy.
Yeah, and we'll wrap it up with this last question here. Now, you had gone back to Vietnam.
Correct.
Was it once or twice?
Once.
Once you've gone back?
Yeah.
And what year was that?
That was 1996.
1996.
Right.
I know you just mentioned a little bit the building and stuff like that. First of all, what was that trip like going back, and how had Vietnam changed in your opinion?
The trip was great. In fact, I had wanted to go back to Vietnam decades before that, and but the country wasn't open. And this was the first trip that was specifically for veterans to specifically visit the areas where their divisions had served. So we got to see the area around Saigon, and then the area up in the Central Highlands like Dak To and Kon Tum and such, and then basically a lot of I Corps, and then we ended up going up to Hanoi too. Okay, I forgot. What was the question? How has it changed? How has the country changed? The Vietnamese people are very friendly, very friendly. They like Americans. Basically, even though their currency, the Vietnamese currency, is the dong, American dollars are readily accepted across the board in the whole country. The interesting thing about the people is that the most outgoing people are in the area around Saigon. I should say Ho Chi Minh City, but and the further north you go, the more reserved they become. It's not until you get up to Hanoi where the people are very reserved. It's not they're not as outgoing. They're much more stoic than they are in the south. But they're still, they will help you. They will do things, but it's much more regimented and much more military based, and they're stoic and they're reserved. But the Vietnamese people are great. They really are, and the country has changed. And I actually one of the people that was on that first trip has gone back several times every year for maybe 15 years after that. And he said, the way we saw it in 1996, you wouldn't even recognize it now, because there's been that much change and development. The American hotels now, when we were there were, if there were any hotels at all, they were Vietnamese hotels, or they were ones that were financed by the Australians or the Kiwis, and they were operated by Australians or New Zealanders. Vietnamese couldn't stay in them, and travelers like us couldn't stay in the Vietnamese hospitals. So there was kind of a dual society. There was the Vietnamese society, and then there was a society that was just for the foreigners, and that has changed considerably now. But it's so far removed that the vast majority of Vietnamese, that's ancient history. They weren't even born then, and in their mind, our Vietnam War was really just part of a long stretch of war that they have gone through for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. Whereas for us, it was a quick blip on the screen, but for them, it was just part of a larger picture, a larger mosaic. But the Vietnamese are really they're very energetic. They're very friendly. They're very outgoing, and they're just good people.
Good people.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thanks for doing this interview with me.
You're more than welcome.
For about an hour. So, yeah, thanks very much.
Okay. Great.
That's all I got.
Now you're sure this worked?